Good morning. Let me welcome you back to this conference. My name is John Steele. I'm the chair of the Department of Egyptology and Assyriology, and I'm pleased to say we were one of the co-sponsors of this conference. So I'd like to thank Felipe and Jonathan for organising this wonderful event. It's nice yet again to be co-sponsor of another event here in the Joukowsky Institute. We have a long history of collaboration between our two units, so it's nice to have yet another co-sponsored event. And I'd like to thank Joukowsky Institute and Peter for hosting the event here in this wonderful building. I don't plan to say any more, so let me get straight underway with introducing this morning's speakers. I think this morning, because we have 3 papers in the session, we're going to take questions at the end of every presentation rather than saving them for the end of the session. So our first speaker this morning is Pavel Hnila from the Freie University in Berlin to present his paper on the afterlives of South Caucasian dragon stones.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Felipe and Jonathan for organizing this very interesting conference and for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here. The topic of my talk is the afterlives of the South Caucasian dragon stones, and it's a part of a larger project that I conduct with my colleagues Arsen Bobuchian from the Academy of Sciences in Yerevan and with Alessandra Gilibert from Venice. I myself am based in Berlin. In the first part of my talk, I will speak about what the dragonstones are and then continue with the secondary traits that we documented on these stones. In the third part, I will concentrate on the question how the ancient observers made sense out of these monuments. I will try to argue, adding to the discussion of yesterday, that the word afterlives in this sense, or in this particular case, makes sense. As you can see in the introductory picture, these monuments are portable. So this is different from rock-cut reliefs, but they have also a number of features in common, especially their durability in landscape. So why do we call these objects dragonstones? Basically because this is how the locals call them. They are in Armenian called vishaps, or dragons, and the same in Kurdish and in Turkish, ajdahas, and this is how they came first introduced into scholarly literature. But basically these are stone stelae, 3 to 5 meters high, decorated. They are outliers in both directions, smaller and bigger ones. And we distinguish 2 basic categories. The first one is decorated with relief. They are animal hides with ram's head. And these are prepared in a very special way, and they looked as if they were draped on the stones. The second type is completely different. It is a statue of a huge fish. And we know that both imageries are related, since sometimes we find them combined on the same stones. As you can see on this example, where the animal hide is placed on the belly of the fish statue. Dragonstones were discovered in 1909 by Russian scholars Nikolai Mark and Yakov Smirnov. They published a book both in French and in Russian, which was hardly received in the West. There were some reviews, but the stones got forgotten very quickly. Not so in Armenia, but the Armenian colleagues concentrated on symbolic aspects of studying these stones, and there was not even a single map available when we started our project in 2012. So the first thing we did was to map them and we decided to bring the research back to the field. Here you can see the distribution of dragonstones. So the highest concentration is in the Republic of Armenia, where we started our survey in 2012, but they can be found also in southeast Georgia and East Turkey. We expect the future research to complete the picture and make it more balanced, especially what concerns the distribution in East Turkey. And we also expect that they will pop up in northeast Iran. And there is also one example in Azerbaijan, in Nakhichevan. When we look on the special habitat or specific habitat of the stones, it needs to be noted that they occur very high in the mountains. We are speaking about elevation of nearly 3,000 meters above the sea level. As an example, you see the distribution on the Mount Aragats. So the clusters of dragonstone seem to be concentrated in a kind of a ribbon which circles the southern slope of Aragats at an elevation of 2,700 to 2,900 meters above the sea level. This means that dragonstones are snow-free for 3 or maybe 4 months during a year. The rest of the year they are hardly accessible, especially in the winter when there are 4 to 5 meters of snow. So this means that whoever might have observed them had to run into difficulties because of their remote location and because of their seasonal accessibility. We excavate a site on Aragats where we found out the largest known concentration of these monuments. In this 40 hectares large meadow, there are more than 11 of them. And one point that I would like to stress here is that they are not especially visible. One only sees them when he or she enters this large meadow. So they are located in the bottom of this concave plain. It would be pretty easy to move them several hundred meters to the ridge, and they would become intervisible with other cluster of dragonstones. But this was evidently not the case here. It was not intended. We excavated 3 contexts so far in the last 4 years. The first one is secondarily embedded into circular stone structures known as cromlechs from the Caucasian archaeology. We excavated 4 of them, and we know from geophysical prospection that there is a 5th one still close to it. The other 2 dragonstones did not have any architectonic features in which they would be embedded. We have 2 sets of absolute data for dating these stones. First set is related with the circular structures and dates to the Caucasian Middle Bronze Age. In absolute dates we speak about 2200 to 1600 BC, and the other set of data is much earlier. It's Chalcolithic, and the Chalcolithic finds, which are obsidians and small bits of charcoals, were found directly in the pits where these stones were positioned. But we are still very careful about relating it one-to-one with dating of these stones, because they might be residual in this context because of their very small size. So if we want to be very conservative, we can say that the dragonstones can be dated very roughly between the Chalcolithic period and the end of 6th millennium BC and the Middle Bronze Age, 2200 BC. So far to the introduction, we think that these stones are related with the cult of water because of the position they are. And now I will move to the second part of my presentation and will demonstrate what kind of secondary uses we have observed so far. We have visited 87 of these stones. We know them 150, but couldn't visit all of them. And approximately 62% of these stones have some secondary traits. They were manipulated in one way or the other. The biggest group out of 5 in which I divided the secondary traits is recontextualization. And under recontextualization, I understand changing the location of the stone, so changing the physical context in this sense. So when they've been relocated. The second biggest group is reinterpretation, and this is what I call the examples where the stones have been changed in their meanings by transforming the imagery. The third largest group, defacing, obliteration, breakage, so intentional damage. And much less common are signs and graffiti, documented on 9 examples, and profanization with 3 examples. And the profanization, I understand cases of strictly utilitarian use for everyday purposes without any respect to previous function. Now I proceed to list chosen examples as case studies in a chronological order. We think that originally all of these stones have been erected in vertical position, but vast majority of them is laying in horizontal position now, and even in those few cases where they are still standing, we have good reasons to believe that they were secondarily re-erected. So there looks to have been an event where these stones either fell down or were overthrown. We prefer the overthrowing hypothesis because in the 2 cases where we excavated these stones in Karmir Sar, we found them fallen down in exactly the same orientation, the same position, facing the mound of Aragat. It would be really very strange if they would fell down exactly in the same way, the same orientation. So it looks to us that the most appropriate interpretation would be that someone intentionally thrown them down. And this might have been related with a change of symbolic systems, probably of change of religion in this case. In the third example, when we excavated, we found a dragon stone buried. This kind of circular structure is known from Caucasian archaeology for burials of people since Middle Bronze Age onwards until the early Iron Age. So this is a very special treatment where the stone was put in the middle of the circle and covered with stones. So this is what I mean with the afterlife. So it looks like we have an event when the stones were almost killed or died in a way, even were buried, and then it continues. So this would be like the first documented secondary use of these stones, and it would date to the Middle Bronze Age, according to the radiocarbon dates that we have. Another proof that dragon stones have been already laying in horizontal position in prehistoric times is a petroglyph of a wild goat that was produced in packing technique in one of these stones. And as is evident from its position, the stone must have been already lying down. Well, why was it placed just on this stone in a single occasion? We have 10 other stones laying around on the same spot. None of them has a similar petroglyph. And the petroglyphs are pretty common in the vicinity, and wild goat motif is the most widespread motif in the rock art of Caucasus. Alessandra suggested that this was a special case because of the stone, contrary to all other stones, was still visible with its head facing up. The others were facing down. So this might have been some kind of graffiti effect that the people felt attracted just to this particular stone, where also a head of an animal was visible. So another horned animal was placed there. Maybe. Since we excavated the surroundings of dragon stones, we could collect also the material that accumulated there over millennia. And the most numerous category that we find are the obsidians. Some of them date to the Chalcolithic period, some of them can be dated to the Bronze Age, but the vast majority of them is undatable, and they belong to so-called ad hoc instruments that were done by non-specialists on site, because we find also the debitage of these materials from very often inferior quality cores. So it looks like these dragonstones were simply used as banks for working purposes to sit on, and the people made their tools in the vicinity. We know that these people were local because we analyzed those obsidians with portable XRF, more than 200 examples. There were 6 groups. 5 of these groups are the nearest available resources to the people from the Ararat Plain. The farthest we can find is Sarikamish, about 130 kilometers as the crow flies from Aragat. Prehistory ends in the Ararat Plain in the 8th century BC, when the area was incorporated into the Urartian kingdom. And exactly from this period we have a unique inscription, an example where the Urartians put their royal inscription on a former dragonstone. Unfortunately, we do not know the original context of this stone. We know that it was found in Garni, which is 30 kilometers from capital Yerevan. And Garni is special because it's not high in the mountains. This makes it different from the previous examples I've shown. Here we are about 1,300 meters above sea level. But the stone was found in a secondary context as a spoil in a Hellenistic building. So we can only speculate about why the Urartians have chosen this particular stone, whether it was still visible somewhere in the settlement and they tried to countermark with their inscription some previous symbolic meaning, or whether they simply have chosen the stone which was already laying around because it fitted the purpose of placing the royal inscription. It looked very similar to the stela they were used to do anyway. It is striking that, however, the Urartians did not erase the previous image, so they really put the inscription on top of the former imagery. So again, you can think, was this putting their stamp on existing mythology, or was it simply negligence and haste and they didn't care at all? After the fall of the Urartian kingdom, we do not have any datable traits until medieval period. We start to have again many of them about 11th century, where many of these stones have been reused as cross stones, or khachkars as they are known in Armenia. Here you can see 2 of the most outstanding examples found near a chapel in Ulgyur, so high in the mountains, where the previous imagery can still be discerned. So we recognize the animal heads, the ram's heads, which were kind of baptized with crosses, but the general shape is still there. And even the animal hides can be still discerned, despite the crosses and inscriptions that cover them secondarily. We know from the inscriptions that were placed a little bit later that they were brought from a place, a certain place, which is not identified, but which could not be far away. The general habitat is very similar to those that we know from other stones. So this is a landscape that we called Bishapos because of the bishops. Turkic tribes also left their traces on these stones, and we identified a Tamga sign, tribal marks of the tribe Afshar on the very same stone where the petroglyph was already placed. But this time in a different technique, it is incised very deeply. And there are two of these mirror inverted Tamga signs on the same stone. Since we know from the written sources that these tribal marks, these Tamgas, have changed between the 11th and the beginning of the 14th centuries, we are in the lucky situation that we can actually date this Tamga with the precision of 200 years on the stone. So we must be between the end of 11th and 13th century in Karmisar. The next datable trace falls into the Ottoman period. We found near one of the dragon stones a pit that we interpret as a looting pit. And according to radiocarbon dates from this pit, it dates between the 15th and the 17th century AD. And this would be like the first intentional attempt of, at least what we can date, people trying to search for treasures and look if there is something underneath these stones. A practice which continues until today, by the way. Number of activities cannot be dated precisely. This is an example of them. We have several stones that were used as improvised mortars for preparing food. Of course, this could happen in recent times, this could be medieval times, this could be even earlier. It's very difficult to date it securely. In a number of these stones, a number of surfaces, we could observe a lot of cup marks that cover them, placed horizontally, sometimes also vertically. We have the impression that they are not very ancient. Why? Because in the single example when we excavated a dragon stones covered with cup marks, it is on the right image, the line in which the cup marks were applied conspicuously followed the level of modern terrain. Since we are in high mountains, we don't have any erosion there. The soil formation processes are very, very slow. This needs to mean that the stone was laying around already for a very long time before the cup marks were applied. So we expect to be them or recent or medieval at most. The local pastoralists that still go there with their herds of animals are convinced that they are gaming boards. We never saw them playing, so we are not sure whether this is their attempt of making sense of what they see or whether they actually observed something in the past. Also very hardly datable are the examples of intentional destruction of these stones. We have few examples where we are sure that the destruction is recent because there are some witnesses who saw it. There are examples as the right one where we suspect that might be medieval because this was found in a medieval dam. But most of them are just undated. Re-erecting and recontextualization became very popular in the 20th century. But there are some exceptions that we know from the literature where these stones were published already at the beginning of 20th century as standing stones. So they must have been standing earlier. But since they also have crosses, we cannot exclude that they are medieval. So we really don't have a single example where we would be sure that it would be standing from the prehistoric times until today. The motifs, and I have to also stress that it's not that easy to keep these stones standing for hundreds of years or even millennia. We are in the landscape that becomes extremely muddy in the spring and in the autumn, that is covered with 3 to 4 meters of snow in the winter. So the modern attempts of re-erecting these stones sometimes backfired. They were erected in the 70s and 80s, and each year they are slowly moving, like the Tower of Pisa, and they will eventually fall. So only the cases where they cemented them, which they also unfortunately did, they are quite stable. And these few examples that survive certainly from pre-20th century contexts. The motifs in modern times are quite variable, why they re-erected these stones. Some of them are monuments done for people struck by lightning or people who died in the war. They are monuments for friendships. Sometimes they were placed in front of public buildings because they needed to place something big and historic in front of them, or in the parks. Very rarely they are even today used as tombstones. But the local pops are not happy about it. They try to prohibit this habit. If we plot all the secondary traits and try to make them in a kind of chronological overview, we will notice immediately a high boom of secondary use in the medieval times. I think this boom is real, even if even if many of the traits that are currently at the undated category should turn out to be pre-medieval, this discrepancy will remain. And since most of these secondary traits are related with funerary customs, with reuse of those stones as tombstones in medieval times, this needs to mean that something changed in funerary customs. And since the pre-Christian religion in Armenia was Zoroastrianism, probably they were missing these incentives of making tombstones and of using older stones as possible candidates for tombstones. At least this is how I'm trying to make sense of this discrepancy. Now, moving to the third part of the presentation. Why do the local peoples think that these are dragons? Because obviously the original meaning was lost, was forgotten. They didn't recognize anymore, or in most cases, the imagery. And they tried to interpret them as dragons. First, we need to think that what Armenians consider dragons or call dragons is not necessarily what the Europeans or Americans expect. It's not always the reptiles with wings and spitting fire. They can spit fire even in Armenia, but it's not the usual interpretation. Many times they were just huge fish. They were monsters living in the sea or in the lakes. And if you look on our stones, these are huge fish. And they are also strange animal hides, and they are horned heads. So it looks kind of natural that when the previous interpretation or the original meaning got lost, the people recognized dragons in them. Second attempt of making sense of them is through anthropomorphization. There is one dragon stone where it is really obvious. It was found in East Turkey, in Yolboyu or Oltu, near Erzurum. And the animal hooves here were transformed into human hands, secondarily, later on. And there are also multiple bands that point to a belt in the middle of the stone. But again, with dating it, we are in trouble, because anthropomorphic stone stelae are known from East Turkey at least since the 15th century BC, as we know from examples from Hakkari, But even 2,000 years later, Turkic tribes used anthropomorphic stelae in their previous homeland in Altai. So the scale of possibilities is very broad. Another documented example of making sense is interpreting them, or interpreting the imagery on this stone as phallus. It was documented in 1909 in Mojakheti in Georgia, where the local women were observed venerating this stone, going to it, lighting candles in front of it, covering it with fat, touching it, and expecting that they will get their milk back when having problems with breastfeeding. Now, shortly, conclusions. So who in the pre-modern period was interested in Dragonstone? In our case, these were the local mountain communities throughout the ages. We don't have any traces of Zoroastrians. We cannot prove what they did on times, but all the others look and found these stones laying around. State agents were also interested, but also in the cases where these monuments were located at lower altitudes. How did ancient interpreters make sense of the imagery? As I tried to show, through dragons, humans, or phalli. In what way were conflicts resolved between conflicting interpretations? Well, this is a very tricky question with the Dragonstones, and the only example I can think of was the very first one I showed. We might have been in a period which was just the time where the people changed the perception of the Dragonstones, so they still knew their original meanings, and some of them decided to throw them down, while others might have still feel some kind of devotion or at least piety when treating them. And this might have been the way of resolving it, that they decided to bury this stone. Of course, it's a speculation. It's one possibility which we cannot prove in the moment. How can we as contemporary scholars begin to address such questions? Well, I'm really curious to hear what other colleagues will say on this topic. What we are trying to do in our project is, as far as we can, date the secondary traits with paleography, iconography, even with lichens. They can sometimes give us an indication whether it's ancient or recent. There are even some attempts to use lichens for absolute chronology with lichenometry, which is very difficult in this context, I would say. But since lichens take ages to form, it's really improbable that they will be there in large areas accumulated quickly in recent times. This is impossible. Well, we can also excavate the immediate surroundings. This is something which is often not taken into consideration, but since our monuments were laying there over millennia, we can actually trace the activities that took part in the immediate vicinity. So if there is a suspicion that there might be some kind of ritual background in later periods, they might have remained also material traces of these activities. And of course, if we are lucky, we can study written sources, oral tradition, and mythology. We haven't identified any written sources that would be medieval or pre-medieval referring to these stones. You can see these remote areas are really making the circles of possible visitors very limited. But there are some oral traditions and mythology with the dragons and the dragon slaying myths that are often put into connection with Dragonstones. For the very end, I left myself 2 slides that I think will demonstrate how even archaeologists can interact and how can influence and strengthen the local beliefs unwillingly. So the local community in Karmiasar, where we excavate, is a Yazidi community. And we notice that some of them have kind of syncretic religious beliefs, and they believe that the dragons can control weather-related phenomena. This is something which goes back to the Zoroastrian times. And one of those Yazidis warned us of not turning the dragonstone they were excavating. He thought, do not turn this bishop, this dragon, otherwise there will be a huge storm coming. And so we haven't listened to him because we desperately wanted to see what is on the other side of the bishop, what is underneath, how the bishop looks like. So we turned the dragon, and this is what happened 2 hours later. The biggest storm we experienced in 5 years of our activity in Armenia had the hail that completely destroyed our tents. Not the tents of the local pastoralists. Those were left undamaged because they were military quality, done from good quality materials. So you can imagine what the local community thinks now. So this is the archaeologists who got punished for turning the dragon. So we are curious to see what we find this year, and we need new tents, better tents. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk about and the reflections upon the way we interact with the histories of things unconsciously as well. So we have plenty of time for questions, so do we have questions?
Thank you for a fascinating panel. It was really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the reuse of dragonstones as medieval grave markers. And I wondered if there's anything, like, are those markers being transported in the landscape to come to churches, or do you think the churches are being built in places where the dragonstones were anyway? Is there anything about the landscape setting that suggests a preoccupation of the medieval Christian community with antiquity?
I think both. In this particular case that I shown, the church is in a very odd place. There is no settlement. So this is a kind of chapel high in the mountains that is not related with the settlement. So in that case, it's possible that it's actually based on a previous site which had some cultic significance. Also in Karmiasar, we can document a kind of sacred continuity. Even the name of Karmiasar means red rock, but the Armenian name is Tirin Katar, which means Tyr's heights, and Tyr is a goddess known from Zoroastrian mythology. And in Turkish it was called Kızıl Ziyaret. And Ziyaret is a place used for pilgrimage, and even today there is a small chapel with strange stones placing there, making it visible from far away. So there were evidently places where the cult continuity was there, and the stones might have been already close to these places or on the spot, if not in situ, maybe in loco. So they were there. But we also have a number of places where these stones were removed. They were moved down. In one of those medieval stones, it is even written, it was brought from the mountains. And I think this was the usual case. So they usually moved them. They did not remain so many times up there in the mountains. And if they did, the motives can also vary. Those ones that were re-erected, when we asked the pastoralists that are living there, they could sometimes tell us why, what was the motive. So in one case it was, for example, a memorial for a daughter struck by lightning. That's why they erected the stone. We could never arrive at this interpretation if there wouldn't be this oral tradition. Yeah, so this is how I see it.
So I've been writing a paper for Karen for a while on reuse of Urartian inscribed stele. And as you know, there are several dozen Urartian inscribed stele that have been turned into hashkars. And I was wondering whether you or anybody else has noticed a difference between the reuse of Urartian stele and the reuse of dragon stones. When you showed the church with a bunch of bishops around it, I mean, do you know whether there's ever a combination of Urartian inscribed stele and bishops in the same area, in the same Christian area?
No, that I haven't noticed it, and we don't know that there are not so many Urartian stele that we would know of in Armenia. And I suppose that the habitat was also different, because these dragon stones occur high in the mountains, and the Urartian stele are usually lower down. So this is already something which makes them improbable to meet in the original place. But since the dragon stones were later moved, they might have met in the secondary context. But even then, I don't know of any single example from Armenia where it would be the case. And in Turkey, it's very difficult to access these sites. And this is also the reason why we do it in Armenia, because the mountainous area of East Turkey is basically impossible to get permit to work on.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah, yes.
I was just wondering if there's any observed connection with lightning striking these stones in any way in that wide open space when you get electrical storms, whether they put them there either to mitigate the force of lightning on human settlements or to somehow connect to the powers above, or...
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, it could be possible, but since there are so few examples that are actually standing high in the mountains, we don't know how often they get struck by lightning. And the examples that I know and I can think of, they are not close to the camps of pastoralists. So I'm not sure whether this is related. So if they decided really to put them a little bit outside of the camp so that the lightning will not strike the camp, this is what you basically are interested in.
Right, I'm just wondering if there's any evidence of lightning damage on the stones that they probably see.
Not that I knew. I know that our geophysician was able to demonstrate that there was a lightning on the plane, so that what he interprets as strikes of lightning, but not on the stone. But who knows, maybe some of those destructions, which we think is intentional, might be caused by lightning. That's a good point. You can try to follow it and engage some specialists who will recognize those traces.
That's only just a comment, as we started yesterday, the discussion on whether afterlife or is an appropriate term. I really liked your classification of reuse, reinterpretation, reformulation, and I think these exactly are the aspects which allow for such a categorization into afterlife. So the moment you really appropriate the monument and do something else with it and change its function, then you get a second life or afterlife, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Also need to stress that those recontextualizations are often combined with reinterpretation, especially as was evident in these tombstones.
Yes, exactly.
They were often
Yes.
changed the imagery and changed the physical context, so they removed those stones.
So when you're tabulating your data, though, how do you classify that? Which of those two, if there are two, which of those two goes into, for example, your chart of in which periods, which activities were performed on these things? So if you have a cross carved into it and it's been stood up, and you're not sure when it was stood up, how have you tabulated that?
I put it into both categories. In that case, it would be recontextualization and reinterpretation. And in the first chart, I've shown that these were about 57 dragon stones, but 87 straits. So it means that number of these straits occurred multiple times on the same stone. So this is how I decided to treat it. So if there are various straits on the same stone, they will come into 2 or 3 different categories. So if it was relocated, like recontextualization, if the image was changed, also reinterpretation. And if it's broken, also damage.
So can I ask about the burials? Was there a person buried in those mounds next to the stones, or the stone itself was buried? Because if the stone itself was buried, that, as you said, could symbolize the death of a god, and maybe a replacement by some other god. There are cases like that. I know textual evidence, but this could be a nice material description.
Yes, this is a very good question. We haven't found a single bone in these 5 circles. So if there were burials, they might have been either completely decomposed, that we haven't found any traces, or there were cenotaphs, some symbolic graves, which have been there. Under the stone that we think that it was buried, we found small pit, and in this pit there were stones on the side of the pit, and we interpret it as the original pit where the dragonstone was standing, and it is placed in the middle under the stone, so it's impossible that the stone would fall down in a way that it will get repositioned centrally above the place where it stood. Again, nothing was found in this pit other than these stones and 1 piece of charcoal. So this is how we interpret in this particular case that it was the burial of the stone. Also because the dragonstone was covered with other stones. It was not used there as a tombstone. It was not a stele that was standing about some other grave. The other 3 circles close to it, they had something that looks like burial chambers, even with pots in it. So in one of those chambers we found artifacts. We found carnelian beads and 2 pots. So it looks like a grave. If we would find bone there, it would be a grave. But without bones, we don't have this confirmation. Interestingly, even the local pastoralists tell us that their predecessors that buried their dead there, now it's not possible since Khrushchev times, it's prohibited to bury the dead up in the mountains, but previously it was possible, and they tell us that there are no bones. If they would open those graves, the bones are missing. So it must be that it can be that the soil is so aggressive in this volcanic landscape that the bones get decomposed over millennia. It's a possibility, and we try to address it, and we are doing the samples and hope that this will get decided.
Yes, we have one question.
It's a question out of ignorance, but are Khatkas themselves as a kind of a category of object reinterpretations of Vishabs? Or what is the origin of Khatkas that are not actually just reused Vishabs?
This is a highly debated topic in Armenia, where the origin of Khachkars is. But indeed, many scholars think that the origin is in the Dragonstones, and that actually they were inspired by these huge stones that were laying around in the surface, and then this was the inspiration for the Khachkars.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think that the Armenian, the people who have lived in Armenia have had a very intense connection with previous writing systems, and there's a lot of respect for previous, or a lot of interest in previous carvings, and so you see Vishaps turned into Khachkars, Vishaps inscribed in Urartian stele turned into Khachkars, Khachkars that are originally Urartian stele then inscribed in Armenian, and I think the layering of text had a powerful meaning, at least in medieval times, the layering of different writing systems, and so you do get, for example, I mean there are more than 5 Urartian stele that have both a Khachkar and a later Armenian inscription. So I don't know.
That's a possibility, and we also have a number of petroglyphs in the mountains where it is also possible to see this multi-layered approach, where over millennia signs were added. And actually, one of those stones that I shown on Dragonstones, there's 3 different periods and really a lot of different signs. Some of them even undeciphered, so there are plenty of other signs that are not even known what they mean.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to move on, so let's thank our speaker again. Our next speaker is Lorenzo D'Alfonso from the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. He's to present his paper on Forgetting an Empire, Creating a New Order, Second Millennium Block Carved Monuments and Post-Hittite Anatolia.
Oh.
Okay, first of all, I really want to thank once again Jonathan and Felipe for having me here today. It's not just an honor, an honor to have a possibility to come to this town and this university for the first time in my life, but also to, as Beate said, to accept the challenge to get more and more involved with art historical themes. More than what I did before. So, in the course of the second millennium BC, history counts the formation and development of the first big regional power of Anatolia, a power that was structurally so well organized that could overcome for a long period, circa 500 years, the tremendous limitations of a landscape easily exposed to substantial, small-scale climatic variations. This is the Hittite Empire. The visual representation of the 3,500 years old Hittite Empire is today perceivable mainly by the monumentality of its public architecture and in particular its fortifications. On the other hand, rock-carved monuments that we visit today were often not for open display, as in the case of Yazilikaya. Also, when accessible for dimension and execution, they were often of limited visibility and understanding. They consist primarily of carved and engraved figurative reliefs and of Anatolian hieroglyphic inscriptions, sometimes connected to one another, often more independent. In this paper, I will not discuss accessibility of Anatolian hieroglyphic as a writing system, which has been researched mainly by Massimiliano Marazzi and more recently by Annick Payne, but still remains strongly unexplored. It suffices to remind to the public of Near Eastern colleagues that while cuneiform was well known in Hittite Anatolia, only Anatolian hieroglyphic was used for display inscription, possibly because it provided multiple layers of readability, so to be able to reach, at least partially, a larger audience. A general distinction that has been made for rock-carved monuments derive directly from their function. Some of them are connected with cultic activities and cultic journeys, while others only express the political claim over a territory. Interestingly, and I think most typical of the Hittite power, both types of monuments were not exclusively commissioned by the great kings of Hattusa. Rather, the majority of them were produced by subjugated rulers, officials, sometimes even enemies who adopted the medium elaborated by the Hittite power for their own claims, often set against the Hittite Empire itself. Whoever was represented on display would appear in one of two standardized figures that are named in literature the man with the mantle and the man with the bow. These two figures are ubiquitous in the Hittite artwork, from small seals to the big reliefs. Now, forgetting a 500-long big power is not so common. If we think to other ancient Western Asian major political power, just like Uruk, Akkad, the Ur-3 kingdom, Hammurabi's Babylon, and the Assyrian Empire, all this survived at least partially in the memory of later times. What happened that condemned the memory of the Hittite Empire? Discussing this issue will bring us too far. I list in this slide some key elements that likely played a relevant role in this unusual process of oblivion. The romantic, iconic interpretation of the remains of display art as eternal trace of a past civilization did not serve appropriately to rock-carved monuments of the Hittite Empire. If they were carved on stone to last for eternity, some did well, but in Anatolia, none of them transmitted to posterity not even the message of what it was created, and even less the memory of a power controlling for such a long time all of Anatolia. As is well known, for the Greeks, the Ur-mention of Anatolia were the Phrygians, whose languages was even older than Egyptian. The existence of the Hittite power was fully lost. In the relation with their landscape, what meaning and process of reappropriation can we envision for the afterlife of the Hittite monuments? Here I will concentrate, of course, on a shorter scale than what many of you and Pavel before did. In the passage between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the process of reappropriation of Hittite political experience in Anatolia is almost absent, even at the local scale. This is because, as Glatz and Glatz-Poudre have shown, landscape monuments were connected with movable borders within the empire and referred to local claims of political control rooted in the deed's history. After the political turmoil, none of the small powers producing these claims survived. So let's have a look at two main examples, the one of Mira in western Anatolia and the very prominent one of Tarhuntassa in south central Anatolia. You see here on the map. Let me see. Yeah, one is here and the other one is in this region. Let's start with Mira. The relief of Karabel, on which many have written, and among them Herodot and our host Felipe, has been finally attributed in 1998 by Hawkins and Morpurgo Davies to Tarkas Nawa, king of Mira. Despite the records from Hattusa are silent about this king, the bulle, the silver seal, together with documents reporting on strong conflictual situations with the Aegean southern region in the late empire, has prompted Hawkins to suggest that the relief of Karabel sets a claim of political control and independence by the king of Mura over the previous Arzava territories against the Hittite great kings, in a similar way as it is reconstructed, as we will see, for the kingdom of Tarhuntassa. Other researchers are more cautious and interpret the relief as representing the commemoration of the successful exploit of this king in local conflicts against other neighboring post-Arzawian local kingdoms. For my discourse, it is important to note that iconic motifs and space organization of the symbols of power are typical of Hittite display art, but were not at all Hittite in nature when, even though they were produced within the Hittite. When set up, the Karabel monument would not be conceived and possibly also perceived as a Hittite landscape monument, but possibly even as an anti-Hittite one. This monument originated in the Hittite Empire, but need not bring any memory, if not negative, of that power, and even less any ethnic identity, be it called Hittite or Luvian, as is now à la mode. The most relevant episode that caused the production, and here is case 2, of a relevant number of landscape monuments is the confrontation between Hattusa and Tarhuntassa. This covered almost all of the second half of the 13th century. Tarhuntassa was a new capital founded in south-central Anatolia by Muwatalli II, the king who fought against Ramses at Kadesh. After his death, a weak agreement between a second-rank son and successor of Muwatalli and the later usurper Hattusili, which was Muwatalli's brother, brought the capital back in the north. This, however, gave rise to the political claims of Tarhuntassa. Distribution of the landscape monuments of the two parties nicely overlap with the contested borders we read about a lot in the treaties between Hatti and Tarhuntassa that have been that reached us were found in the cuneiform archives of Hattusa. I have recently proposed that the political claims of Tarhuntassa did not aim to create an independent line of great kings of Tarhuntassa, but directly claimed imperial rule. While having a clear territorial meaning along a main route into south-central Anatolia, the relief of Kuruntia at Khatib, whom we know from, of this Kurunta we know from Hittite texts that he was a king of Tarhuntassa. Well, he does not claim here only territorial control, but the whole imperial rule. Not only he adopts iconography, titles, and organization of the relief surface in the association between text and image that directly followed those of his father Muwatalli at Sirkali, but there is no claim for a great kingship of Tarhuntassa, so no place name written in the inscription, no mention of Tarhuntassa at all, rather a claim for absolute, not territorially limited imperial rule. Similarly absolute are the claims for rule of great King Hartepus on the peak of the Kızıldağ, and also here the space organization and symbols of power of the genealogic inscription is specular to the one produced almost at the same time in Hattusa by great King Tudhaliya. The significance of this claim had enormous repercussion for the understanding of the late 13th century Hittite history, but are connected with dynastic disputes between the factions within the Hittite royal family that must have had little echo for after one generation. As much as they were carved for eternity, often secluded in not easily accessible and visible spots, the motivation for the existence of these monuments was ephemeral, and ephemeral in its relation to the landscape and the local communities. Neither Tarkhuntassa survived the end of the empire, nor did the memory of its prominence for 30, 40 years within the second half of the 13th century survive, which had produced the several representation of political claims of rule in form of display rock-carved monuments. To all what I said up to now, there is to my mind one remarkable exception that attests a continuity, an afterlife of a monument in the passage between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. It is one of the monuments associated with King Artepus, and it's called in literature the Throne of Kizildag. It consists of an andesitic reddish rocky outcrop standing out of the northwestern slope of a small volcano overlooking the southern Konya plain, and the volcano is called Kizildag Red Mountain. It is formed by an almost horizontal natural square terrace located circa 2 meters higher than the slope surface overlooking the plain, defined to the southeast by a flat 4 by 3 meter wall made of the same stone. Wall and terrace together give the impression of a chair with a backrest, and the nickname throne already date back to the pioneer geographer and explorer Ramsay. The flat surfaces of the throne are natural and depend on the particular composition of this andesite. Today, as in the past, weathering, but possibly also human presence, have significantly altered the dimension and shape of the throne. All squared blocks collapsed in the picture belonged to the basis of the terrace in the previous years, and some detachments are unfortunately still ongoing in the general lack of interest. On the wall looking at the vast plain is engraved a relief of a man sitting on a throne, holding a stick with his left hand and the cup with his right one. An Anatolian hieroglyphic legend in front of his face identifies him as Artepus, the great king. There are, however, several problems in accepting this identification at face value. Even from a very first impression, one sees that the relief is engraved, while the inscription is carved as a bas-relief in a style defined in Anatolian studies as monumental. For its paleography, the disposition of the signs in a sort of edicula, and for the name and title mentioned, there is no doubt that the inscription belonged with all others shown before as a 13th century part of the claim of power within the dissolution of the Hittite Empire by Artepus. From the very early notes offered by Bossert in 42, Akruggal 49, Kyrieleis in 69, and then the classic work of Hortman and Bittel in the 70s, it was, however, recognized that the relief has a marked Assyrian inspiration. Given that the influence of the Assyrian display art in Anatolia is generally dated to the 8th century, most, not all, scholars dated the relief to this period. This was before it became clear that Artepus may only be a 13th century BC king, though. So, how and why an Assyrianized representation of a king came to be associated with a much later relief was never really discussed in depth. Only John David Hawkins dedicated some attention to it, but moving from paleographic consideration after that concerned mainly the Anatolian hieroglyphic label beside the relief. Nonetheless, these have provided the only interpretation of these rock monuments that starts from the premise that inscription and relief were executed in two different times. So it deserves due attention. The explanation is quite complicated and connects the throne on the Kizildag with a group of inscriptions found in western Cappadocia, the most prominent being the rock inscription of Topada. The inscription reports the deeds of a great king named Wasusarma, son of another great king named Tuvati. A part of this small group of inscriptions, these great kings are otherwise unattested as such. Meriggi, who first studies these inscriptions in depth, came to the conclusion, on the basis of paleographic evidence, that they were archaic, that is, post-Hittite, but earlier than the 8th century. By the late 80s, however, Hawkins changed this dating. Since in the Assyrian royal inscriptions and other documents of the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, 4 Neo-Hittite kings, named, and among them Urballa, mentioned in this famous letter, named in the Topada inscription, are attested as tributary subjects of the Assyrian Empire after its expansion toward the northwest, Hawkins consequently dates the inscription to the second half of the 8th century. There are some problems, though, with this interpretation. Wasusarma, who appears in the form Ushurma, is never referred to as a great king as is in Topada, but only as a minor figure. This big discrepancy has been explained by Weipert and ultimately by Mark Whedon as a claim of great kingship by Wasusarma, dictated by the desire of imitating the Assyrian king. Another problem is the paleography. Hawkins admits that the paleography of the group is entirely different from that of all other Anatolian hieroglyphic inscriptions of the 8th century from the same region, even thus mentioning a king Wasusarma and a king Tuvati. But he ascribes this difference to a choice of archaization, characterizing the Topada group of inscription, not by their being archaic. The archaization would be derived from the paleography of the inscriptions of Hartapus. This builds a direct link between the throne in Kizildag and Topada, while connecting the paleography of Topada to the one of the inscription of Artapus. He established a direct link between the dynasty of great kings of the late 8th century and a previous experience of great kingships which took place in the same region. Thus, the Assyrianizing relief engraved besides the Anatolian hieroglyphic label of Artapus dating to the 13th century would embody a new conception of great kingship that merges the inherited local use of landmark display inscriptions in Anatolian hieroglyphic with the iconic representation of power inspired by the new, impressive Assyrian political machine. While this hypothesis offers a coherent explanation, is that not engaged in the meaning of iconology of the relief itself. As a matter of fact, notwithstanding the historical and art historical relevance of the relief, the first in-depth formal technological and iconological analysis of the monuments stays, to my knowledge, with the unpublished MA thesis of Matteo Pedrinazzi, whom I thank for allowing me to present here his conclusion, despite very abruptly and concisely. The title of his work, Indagini su Artapus, immediately reminds us of the masterpiece of Carlo Ginzburg, Indagini su Piero, wonderful venture of microhistory into the world of art historical interpretation of Italian Renaissance. A formal analysis of the single motifs and the style of the engraved relief reveals that despite the presence of local elements, such as the hat with folded earmuffs and the upwards pointed shows, possibly the shape of the throne, most of the elements adheres to the representation of the Assyrian king more directly than what is normally the reception of Assyrian motifs typical of the 8th century Syro-Hittite art. If compared with other, even geographically close landscape monuments showing the reception of an Assyrian style, as the Ivris relief does, it seems that the artist who engraved the relief of the throne of Kizildag had a well-defined Assyrian iconographic model in mind, which is not the case of the other Assyrianized relief of the region. To make a point, the representation of the king seated on a throne is not represented anywhere else in Anatolia, whereas kings and rulers are always represented as standing figures. The upward position, just to look at details, the upward position of the fingers of the right hand holding the cup also finds parallel only in Assyrian art, and so the definition of the muscles of the forearm. Despite the model underneath the realization of the relief of Kizildag is Assyrian, the execution by a local artisan seems very likely because of the addition of the few local elements that I mentioned before, as well as the volumetry of the human figure. The extreme simplicity of the execution of most details, and in particular the throne, as well as the choice of engraving instead of carving the relief, is very likely indicative of the limited time the artisan was given to finish the work, whether because of time pressure or, less likely, little significant and therefore little investment by the patron. The most important result of the formal and stylistic analysis is that the most fitting parallels in Assyrian art are with a very early stage of the Assyrian display artworks, those dating to the kings Assur-Nasir-Pal II and Salmaneser III in the first and middle part of the 9th century. Particularly fitting are the representation of Assur-Nasir-Pal drinking from a cup on the throne from Nimrud, and that of Salmaneser in the same situation on the Balawat gate. This is very important in our attempt of dating the Kizildag relief. Its dating to the late 8th century depend exclusively from the date assigned by Hawkins and Whedon to the Tupada inscription via the Assyrian inscription. In fact, there is no evidence that Tupada is an archaizing inscription, since it bears not a single late sign together with the older ones, which is the criterion to recognize archaizing inscriptions from archaic. As for the sign Wa showed in this table, all signs and scribal habits of Tupada are well rooted in the 10th and 9th century BC. What is at stake here is not a mere discussion about changing dates of, some 30, 40 years. No, I'm not interested in that. Rather, it is whether we should envision the presence of a reconfiguration of complex political entities within Anatolia before the impact of the Assyrian expansion, so to change the model of secondary states. That is the way these new Assyrian polities have been conceived for a long time. In a paper presented to the AOS last year, I provided a new interpretation and dating of the inscription of Tupada. I showed that the personal names attested in the inscription were all dynastic names already attested in the 9th century and possibly even as earlier as the 11th century. If my identification of the land of Tuali in the Tiglath-Pileser, the first annals, with the land of Tuati in the later inscription of Argishti I, and ultimately our great king Tuati in Tupada is accepted. The sole Wasuzarma is only attested in the 8th century inscriptions, but given that it is a dynastic name as well, one wonders whether this name too might be adopted by more kings. I have suggested that the war narrated in the long inscription, in fact the longest inscription and the longest and most detailed account of a big military clash of post-Hittite Anatolia, reports no less than a war between a coalition of the post-Hittite kings led by great King Yasusarma against a coalition of 8 major and minor rulers under the guidance of the king of Phrygia. The inscription reports, in fact, the king, sometimes named also as man, of the city of Parisuta, and that would be the hieroglyphic Luwian form for Friku Wanda, the final Wanda being a typical geographic suffix of Anatolian toponym, and Friku, the root for the ethnic political designation. For such a war, there is no space in the 8th century, as we know, and even less in the late 8th century. The suggestion of a backdating of the Topada inscription group nicely fits with the results of the formal analysis of the reliefs by Pedrinazzi. In both cases, the question of the significance of the post-imperial recarving of the reliefs still remains open. So let's try to go there. The iconological study of the relief might provide some relevant hint in this direction. The scene of the drinking king represented in Kizilda once again is an unicum. The drinking seated person, whether a king or not, is nowhere else represented without other persons. On Kizilda, one might adventure to reconstruct that other figures might have been engraved on the lost portion of the wall to the right of the reliefs, besides the fracture, so these area. A more likely solution is that given the little time and consequent essential character of the Kizilda relief, the representation of the seated king was a simplification of the original iconologic scene. What then this scene meant? Kings seated on a throne are always represented with a figure bringing offering in the choreographic scenes of the funerary banquets of the Syro-Anatolian tradition. Or are they accompanied by servants in the feasting scenes at the palace in the Assyrian tradition? A third scene featuring the king seated on a throne is attested on the Balawat Gate and later on again in the relief of Sennacherib from Nineveh. They feature the king observing and then celebrating a military victory far away from Assyria. If our hypothesis of an earlier 9th century date of the relief is corrected, then the latter iconological interpretation, the one of the king celebrating a military victory, opens our understanding to 2 meaningful hypotheses. Let's explore them. The most likely hypothesis links the relief of Kizilda with the military success of King Yasusarma over Phrygia, as they are narrated in the inscription of Topada. In order to reaffirm the diachronic legitimation for the great kingship, Yasusarma commissioned a new, clearly post-Hittite engraved reliefs as a victorious king. He did not alter the label with the name of the previous king, but the scene could be understood as a reference to the military victory obtained by him in continuity with previous local great kings' experiences. The contact with Assyria after Salmanasar campaign remains the reason for the shift in iconology of the king. The second, less likely but nonetheless attractive hypothesis consider whether the relief could in fact represent Salmanasar himself, engraved by a local artisan. The royal inscription on the Nimrud statue of Salmanasar reports that at the end of the campaign against the 24 kings of Tabala, before crossing the Taurus towards Cilicia Kue, close to the Mount Muli, today's Bolkarda, Salmanaser built his image, which is a likely reference to the carving of a display monument, stelae-relief. The adoption of a local artisan by the Assyrian king is, to my knowledge, not really attested, but would very well fit the textual source mentioned above, the political scenario, and in a way also the fast, little elaborated style of the artwork. I conclude. The oblivion of the memory of a 500 years long living, unprecedented polity in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, has many reasons, but one of them may well be that the landscape monuments that were produced during the last 100 years of its existence were more or less visible and accessible, were not conceived in a solid and deep relation with the landscape and the communities where they were established. Their distribution responds to claims of local control over disputed areas or routes within and not outside at the frontiers of the territory of the empire. Those disputes were episodic, often promoted by kings or officials not part of the local communities themselves. Under the circumstances, it is understandable why most of these monuments, and in particular those not implying a ritual performance, were not integrated in the memory of the local communities and were rediscovered only and re-cementized only in few cases and with meaningful time hiatus, after a meaningful time hiatus. The exception provided by the Kizilda throne relief is therefore even more surprising. The only rock monuments of the 13th century that was preserved, likely restored but surely restructured and reused after 400 years, originally referred to an opponent of the kings of Hattusa, even though a member of the same royal family. We know too little about the motivation for the selection of this monument over others, but possibly, as Felipe showed us yesterday, the prominence of the natural andesitic outcrop over the plain, lake. Even if the visibility from down the slope is very reduced, the representation of the victorious seated king of the 9th century means that the throne had acquired a determinant role in redefining and amplifying kingship in south-central Anatolia at that time. Its macro-historical context may be the military success of great King Yasusarma, or it may be the military campaign of Salmanaser in Anatolia. For the longue durée, the most striking element is the complete change of the representation of the king from the 13th to the 9th century. If compared with the continuity in adoption of the scene of the king walking over the corpse of the enemies on the Zagros presented yesterday by Beate, the abrupt change in representation of the king from the standardized figure of the priest or the warrior into the new seated figure on a throne implies that the interruption of the tradition of the Hittite tradition on the Hittite period was already complete by the 9th century. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. That was really exciting. If we assume that it could be perhaps a Shalmaneser relief, you would have, in fact, the same strategy that he used in the Tigris Tunnel in form of illusion. I mean, in the Tigris Tunnel, it's the Urbana Tarasu gesture, but it's a cultic context, taken out of a cultic context, without having the addressees, the gods. So that shows only to have this particular gesture. Nonetheless, you know what it is about.
Yeah.
Here, you also only have the seated king without any kind of surrounding, because it is, apparently very quickly applied. But nonetheless, you have the banqueting scene, which is also, in fact, if you believe the inscription, it is a cultic context, because the gods normally are invited to this kind of banquet after the victory. So it would make sense to me to read it, in fact, as a Shalmaneser rather than...
I completely agree with you, honestly. It's the first time that I present, so I just realized, reading back the work of this student of mine, that it really fit the new dating that I suggested, and that it could be 9th century. And at that point, I went back reading the Syrian royal inscription, and I looked for this hypothesis, but I really wanted, first of all, to confront Assyriologists and see what they would think of this, because it would be an unicum in the fact that a local artisan was used instead of... It's also true that was the first campaign, so outside in the mountains in that area by Salmanese, and so my heart also goes in that direction. The other one has a big problem to me. So if it should be a representation of Wasusarma, he might have left the older inscription because of respect of the tradition, so things that we know. But he would have added a new one with his own. So even scratches like the one we find in Malatya for Pugnus Mili. There are this monumental, very well carved one, and then later on, for a new Pugnus Mili, some new are engraved just besides some relief that had none. So it's very difficult, and it is very difficult for me to think that Wasusarma would adopt a so clear Assyrian model. So that's...
I have more of a comment, really, in teaching this class about rock reliefs. One of the hardest obstacles is that reliefs have been studied by culture, as you know, and a lot of the catalogs are culture by culture, except perhaps Burker-Clan's sort of synthesis of a lot of reliefs. And it seems to me obvious in the case you present, but in so many other cases, that there is, of course, cross-cultural interactions in the place of reliefs, and that reliefs are responding to different, let's say, cultures, but the people around it. And so I am completely persuaded by your idea, even though I'm not a Assyriologist. And I think that now is sort of the time to start thinking about this cross-cultural interaction of reliefs, how reliefs from whatever one respond to a different, and the Tigris Tunnel, but also in the case of these things, the Neo-Assyrian reliefs in Uzunolan Tepe that Tashurek published. I mean, they also they don't look at all like the Imperial Hittite ones, and in some way it would be interesting to think about this in relation to those. And the second thing about Kızıldağ in particular, but about, again, Hittite rock reliefs more generally, is that it seems to me that the performative whatever happened there is a performative dimension here that is more clear than in other places. And of course, yesterday we talked about the later inscriptions that mention action around there. Yeah. But I guess one thing that is interesting to me is there any other evidence of sort of the gestural of the gesture that king is adopting within the Hittite tradition? Is there
of the cup
or cups themselves of that nature? Or
no, not for sure, not in the imperial tradition. But even if you go in the post-Hittite, where you have, so we would need Pavel's wife here, so not that guy. But so where you find this is Syria. But the situation in Syria, so I want to go back having a look there, or maybe someone else could do that. We do not have in Anatolia reuse of any of these Hittite Empire reliefs in later building activities or whatever. We have that in Syria, prominently. Aleppo is one case. What's the other big temple? Ain Dara is the other case, where you have 13th century reliefs that are moved and reused in the so-called Palestine Taita phase. And this kind, okay, this is out of our interest, rock carved stuff. But if just we think at figurative art, so the kind of relation with the past, with the Hittite past that we see in the south and that we see within Anatolia is different. And I agree with you, one of the nice things that I was looking at, not just intercultural contexts, but the idea that once a context is established, it's a mainstream. That is false. You may have different contexts producing different artistic venues, just like Ivris is so different from Kizildag. And yeah.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating talk. If it is Shalmaneser III, how do you explain the shoes? Because the shoes are really very local, aren't they? The shoes, the typical shoes.
I explain.
So I would say the shoes, in my opinion, are an indication that the other theory you were putting forward, that it is a local thing which picks up, let's say, Assyrianizing models of how to present kingship, appears for me to be more plausible idea.
Do you want to follow up, or should I answer?
I should follow. I'd like to follow up with a very short point. It does remind me of Zingerli, in some ways. I mean, the scene of a seated king with the feasting, the banquet, with a cup in his hand. It does appear there in Zingerli in Kutamua.
Yeah. I showed here, not Kutamu.
Yes,
which one did I show here? Which guy did I brought?
You brought maybe...
This must be a Barakib.
Barakib, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
This must be Barakib.
And Barakib is actually recognizing he's being a vassal to the Assyrian king.
Absolutely, absolutely. But here you see huge differences. So here, the way the body is represented is fully non-Assyrian. Have a look at the hair, have a look at the muscles, and the way the cup is held. That is, so it recalls the Assyrian one, but have a look at the fingers. That's where was it? So what you have here is really this model in which it's not even clear where the cup goes deep down or just stays on top. This is just to say, I think both hypotheses are possible. Where I see a difference with Zincherli is that in order to carve this guy with the muscle done this way, you must have a model. And someone must have drawn you a cartone, so that you start and then you change stuff. Of course, this does not imply that.
It's absolutely convincing, I think. This point is absolutely convincing.
Yeah. So this does not imply that it is Salmaneser. So I fully acknowledge that this does not.
Shoes, yes. But this is convincing.
Yeah. Even though this is just devil's advocate, they are always with sandals. But if you go to Anatolia and it's cold, maybe even His Majesty, His Excellency, might have.
Thank you. Well, I think we better end there. So we're running out of time. Maybe we can come back to some later discussion. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And our final speaker in this session is Jen Thum. Jen is a PhD student in the Joukowsky Institute here at Brown, and she's going to tell us 3 short stories about Egyptian rock relief.
Thank you, Jonathan and Felipe, for conveniently bringing us all together to talk about the subject of my dissertation. I have to admit that the particular topic of today's papers, the afterlives of rock monuments, is wholly out of my comfort zone, and echoing what many others have said. I've been working on Egyptian royal rock reliefs, which have not been studied together as a group before, to try and understand the motivations that would lead the royal establishment, which could in theory make any sort of monument they wanted, anywhere they wanted, to inscribe rather than to build. But in putting this paper together, I had to come to terms with their monumentality through time, not just the functions and the symbolism they were supposed to embody for their patrons. So these are new avenues for me, and I welcome your comments. Before I get started, I want to talk to you about narrative. When I was first thinking about this topic, Felipe pointed me in the direction of the JMA article by the classicist Grant Parker, which you heard a bit about yesterday. Parker's narrating monumentality is the study of the life of an Egyptianizing obelisk in Rome's Piazza Navona. It raises questions about what makes something a monument, how monuments are implicated in time, and how we can understand their meaning and their impact on new viewers. For Parker, where the story ends is actually in the past, because he constructs his narrative of the life of that obelisk backwards, starting from the present day. When I first read that, I thought, well, that's just kitschy. Doing an object biography in reverse isn't really going to tell us anything new about it. It just sounds provocative. But actually, here's why he did it. First, it forces us to acknowledge that the point at which we begin telling history is not the beginning in absolute terms. We've naturalized the idea of an origin, but this is a choice that we make. Parker's narrative replicates the direction of contemporary inquiry into the object's past instead of the shape of its life. It helps us ask questions about why certain episodes in that life happened, rather than just accepting that they did. And second, if we work backwards, we can begin to give later processes of appropriation equal weight with the original intentions behind the monument. Its conception becomes just one episode in its life among many, and we can then explore how it was implicated in a variety of physical and interpretive contexts. A lot of Parker's analysis centers on the fact that obelisks in their afterlives became mobile. He says that because they were transported with great effort and wonder to new places in the Roman world, they took on the qualities of commodities and prestige items, which allowed the symbolism of the deep past of Egypt to permeate subsequent points in space and time. I thought it would be interesting to try Parker's method with a different type of Egyptian monument, one that is immobile, to see how they too may have permeated new points in space and time, despite always being stuck in the same place. That's not just because it's interesting to think about how things changed around them And it's not necessarily to offer a range of views on the same object, as Valeria and Felipe did with great success last night. No, I thought this would be a useful exercise because I think that Parker's method can bring us closer to the Egyptian understanding of event and response. Egypt is often presented, especially in popular culture, as an unchanging entity from a mysterious and not fully retrievable era. But of course, it wasn't monolithic. Over 3 millennia of pharaonic history, the Egyptians often reflected back on their own past, and they too viewed certain points as distant and even unknowable. So today I'm going to use Parker's method to tell 3 short stories about living rock reliefs and the material reactions that reveal how they might have been received by later generations of Egyptians. In order to interpret these reactions, we first need to understand how Egyptians thought about the past. In the Egyptian world, time itself was understood as having 2 dimensions, a lived time and a cosmological one. This is similar to the way Lynn Foxhall divides ancient Greek time into human time and monumental time. Human time is local, concerning events that are usually remembered for only a few generations and within families or small communities. Monumental time is permanent, the only domain through which posterity is accessible. Cosmological time was defined according to 2 notions, jet and nehech. These are often described as being linear and cyclical time, respectively. Jet is an eternal pattern, while nehech is the continual repetition of that pattern. Jan Assmann has used linguistics to explain them, whereas our notion of time is based on past, present, and future, as expressed in the tenses of our language. Egyptian, like other Afroasiatic languages, has 2 aspects, the perfective and the imperfective. What changes and moves in cycles, not just daily cycles, but also yearly cycles, cycles of rulership by series of kings, and so on. What moves in cycles in nehech time, but is not yet completed, once it is completed, joins the domain of jet time. Both are cultural attitudes toward the world, with jet time representing the enduring continuation of events that have already been completed. It's a view that looks to repeatedly enter those events into a deep, sacred time of origins. The origin of the universe, the first time, was entered into a sort of canon in the cosmological time. Everything was understood as stemming from the first time. The maintenance of order, facilitated by the king as a mediator between his subjects and the gods, was done in order to return to and suspend the world in a state most like this first time. By their individual actions, kings and other figures in the royal establishment also sought to renew the world to the golden age when the gods reigned upon the earth, before the rule of kings. Jean Leclante has described this as, and I quote, the fundamental nature of Egyptian civilization. The civilization of stone obstinately turned towards the results of its beginnings, seeking to repeat them, however harsh that sounds. And so Parker's counter-diachronic narrative turns out to fit quite well with the Egyptian experience, which appears always to be hearkening back to a time before and recognizing events by looking back at them. But although people often reflected on the past, there was no concept of a linear history in ancient Egypt, at least not in our sense. That's because, in general, no event was seen as a historical singularity. Almost everything was yet another iteration on a pattern that had happened before, an event following a pre-existing model that harkened back to the first time. Pascal Vernous has written about the inherent tension here. If everything follows a pre-existing model, then how did Egyptian ideology explain or even justify the singularity of some events? The first story is about just that. This is the Hagar el Merwa, a quartz outcrop jutting out of the desert near the fourth cataract of the Nile in Sudan. It was identified as the southernmost point of the world, also known as the Horn of the Earth, because in the Egyptian world, everything is oriented towards the south, so your horns would be in the south. The shape of this outcrop, like two horns protruding from the sand, is perhaps one reason why it was recognized as such. It's pretty difficult to see the epigraphic activity on this outcrop in our day, partly because the quartz was so difficult to carve that it was not carved into deeply, and partly because of some weathering. But if you go there today and you look very closely, you'll see things such as this. Layers of inscriptions and rock art that populate the same space, not fully obscuring or erasing each other, reminders of what was there before. The most recent markings on this outcrop can be seen here in gray. People on the backs of animals, fitted into and on top of the body of this red-painted lion. It's unclear exactly when these markings were made, although they're definitely post-Pharaonic, and almost certainly made by members of a local population. One may imagine that the people who placed them exclusively over this earlier image, which is the closest figural decoration to the ground and therefore the most accessible space, were trying to usurp this outcrop and the landscape around it from the people who made the previous inscriptions. Before the time of those latest rock drawings, this outcrop was arguably one of the most significant locations in the Egyptian world. During the New Kingdom, it was the southern boundary of Egyptian hegemonic control. People didn't visit it, though. There's no archaeological evidence to suggest any Egyptian settlement or even seasonal activity in the area. And yet it seems that it was known or imagined, as we hear from the annals of Egyptian kings and the autobiographies of members of the military, as the faraway place designated as the end of the world. An official from the reign of Ramses II, the Viceroy Setau, visited this important site sometime in the 13th century BC and left at least 2 inscriptions there, his name and title, and the cartouches of his king. Marina Brown has suggested that the act of carving cartouches into the rocks in frontier zones, which began as early as the First Dynasty, was a way of annexing those areas to Egypt. The name, acting like a stamp, marks the place just past the last point of military activity and serves both to signal the members of the next campaign in which direction they should go next, while also placing a hold of sorts on that landscape. But as we'll see in a moment, this outcrop was already Egyptian in the Egyptian mind. So Setau was perhaps symbolically reasserting the Egyptian possession of this outcrop under Ramses II. A third inscription can probably also be assigned to his visit. It's dated to year 44, when he's known to have campaigned in the area, in the reign of a king whose name unfortunately does not survive. Here you can see that the cartouches of Ramses and the year 44 inscription were placed quite deliberately in the context of some earlier reliefs. 3 centuries earlier, 2 almost identical royal tableaux were made here by the 18th dynasty kings Thutmose I and Thutmose III, who were largely responsible for establishing Egypt as an empire. Each consists of a stela and bull and lion figures, representing a local version of Amun-Ra and the king. In its central portion, each bears the same text. As for any Nubian or any foreigner who violates this stela, which my father Amun has given to me, his chiefs will be beheaded, Ra-Atum will endure, and the sky will not rain for him, his cattle will not calve, there will be no heirs of his upon the earth. Vivian Davies, head of the expedition at this site, notes that this is a specific threat to the local population. The reference to the absence of rain, in a dry period brought on by the enduring sun, Ra-Atum, betrays an Egyptian understanding of subsistence patterns among local communities, that nomadic cattle herders could not afford to experience a drought. Here, Thutmose III added 2 additional lines of text to his tableau. No king had reached this place since the time of Horus, except for my grandfather. The like has not occurred since the time of the primeval ones, that my majesty returned to the boundary of the north and the boundary of the south, to Miu, in victory. A necessary footnote to explain why the carving of his boundary stela was a momentous occasion. This text is a direct response to an additional text of Thutmose I, who also felt that further explanation was due. No king has reached this place since the time of Horus, except for me. The claim of Thutmose III is a perfect example of how the Egyptian royal establishment got around the problem of historical singularities. Following Vernus, improving on the model of a previous king, so something that has happened before, is an acceptable claim to make because it is an adjustment on something that is already complete and therefore perfect, making it more perfect. Thutmose III did not just visit the boundaries of the north and the south. He returned to them using the verb anen, which means to return, maintaining the boundaries of his forefather, which is a major ideological goal for any king, while exceeding his accomplishment in some way. He's proudly the first person to return there because he couldn't be the first person to go there. The Thutmose I inscription, on the other hand, is permitted to be the first event of its kind because it is the first time since the time of Horus. This implies that in the time when the gods ruled the earth, the location was known and perhaps reached by another divine king. That this place was revealed to the king as a location where the southern boundary of the world ought to be is another way of accepting the singularity. It was already part of the perfect ordered world. It just needed to be rediscovered. Revelations and wonders were, according to Vernus, a second acceptable avenue for expressing the singularity of an event in the Egyptian ideology. Not only do the texts of both stelae explicitly reference the time of the ancestors, that time that was enshrined in the canon of Egypt's deep past, I argue that by being inscribed into living rock, they also materially tie the event of reaching and formally establishing this boundary to the first time. Bedrock, like most elements of the world in the Egyptian view, had a divine quality. Although there was no single god of the bedrock, various deities took the form of particular rock formations. Aside from the fact that this outcrop took the shape of the literal horns of the earth, making it a fixed part of the ordered world, its physical connection to the landscape meant that it would have been inherently associated with the mound of creation, the bit of earth that protruded from the waters of non-existence at the beginning of the universe, whose emergence from those waters marked the start of the first time. I discussed this recently with Anne-Claire Salmas, whose work concerns the daily experience of space and time in Egypt. We theorize that by carving his stela into the rock, a material associated with the first time, the first Thutmoses was attempting to materially infiltrate monumental time with an event from his lived time. Quite literally, he inscribed it into the cosmological time, the deep time of what is perfect and completed, which could then serve as a model to be followed by his grandson. Although we have many monumental inscriptions with dates, including some royal rock reliefs, it's significant that these events are both undated. This can be read as one more way to allow them to occur perpetually. And there's still more to these events. The numbers in this drawing represent more than 70 names and elite titles inscribed or painted onto its surface. These are the signatures of the attendants who were part of both expeditions to the outcrop. John Baines has noted that the journey to this spot would have been arduous. It wasn't tourism, he says, but an achievement and a trying experience worth recording. If we take Baines's view, then these signatures can be understood as events in the lived time, because they point to the identities and experiences of individuals, as opposed to the stelae that further defined the shape of the Egyptian world. But I consider these to be less marks of personal achievement and more of a witnessing of the entry of these events into the cosmological time. These performances are also part of these events that changed the world, enshrined in that time. They do not contain personal anecdotes or wishes, only names and titles. In its physical relationship with the earlier stele, that inscription of Ramses' viceroy Setau also appears to want to enter the cosmological time. But it does not follow the pattern of the deeds of the Thutmosids on Ramses' behalf. Instead, it gives the sense that Setau, passing by, wanted to record his presence in the area of the well-known monumental southern boundary as a personal achievement in the lived time, quite like Baines described. The association of his own deeds with the Thutmosid inscriptions can be seen, in Parker's terms, as a signal that he saw them as maybe something like a prestige item, and drew on this quality to bolster the importance of his own inscribing performance. Before the Ramessids and the Thutmosids, the Hagar el-Marwa was already a meaningful place for the local Nubian population. The royal reliefs themselves obliterated indigenous rock drawings of people and animals, including cattle, the remnants of which can still be seen in some places on the outcrop. That practical threat from the main text, that the enemy's cattle shall not calve, even gives the sense that the stelae respond directly to this imagery. One cannot see these drawings from the Nile, nor from the land routes in the area. And yet the Egyptians appear to have known about the local significance of this rock before they arrived there. Without seeing it themselves before, probably with the help of local guides who knew about culturally and geologically significant places in Nubia, the first Thutmoses and his expedition were able to imagine the monumentality of this outcrop, designate this place as rightfully theirs, and aim right for it. I cannot help but wonder if it was anything like what they were expecting. The second story is about absence. These are the remnants of a stela. A closer look reveals some digging underneath it. This is a hole in the hillside where another stela used to be. And this is why. Stela P was blown to pieces by gunpowder a few years ago by Copts, who expected, as all Egyptians do, to find that the stela was a door to a hidden treasure chamber. This explosive method was used at this site as recently as 2004, and at other sites it is still attempted even now. It's actually quite common at the sites of living rock stelae in Egypt because this type of monument has long been interpreted as akin to the X on a treasure map. Before those events, these monuments were also subjected to an intentional, although not so thorough, campaign of erasure, which has been attributed to various later Egyptian rulers who wanted to condemn the policies of this period, while still leaving evidence of what had been done to deserve it. But no other monuments were built on this site. They've been here on their own for so long that people think that they are guarding something. The images I've just showed you are of the boundary stelae of the city of Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. This was the short-lived capital founded by Akhenaten, formerly Amenhotep IV, who's often called a heretic, or, to take a rosier view, the founder of monotheism. The city was founded as a new home for the king and his eccentric solar cult. Its boundary stelae formed a ring around the site from their positions in the surrounding cliffs. They would have been painted white, reflecting light so as to be seen from quite far away. Roads were made leading up to them because they were intended to receive cult, and we can only assume that in the dozen or so years before the city was abandoned, they did. Their texts contain an oath made by the king never to move the city from this location, which was miraculously revealed to him by the sun disk, the Aten. Remember that one of the acceptable ways of doing something new in the Egyptian ideology was by divine revelation. What was there before the boundary stelae? Nothing. Umar Harmansa has written that carving a rock relief is like founding a new city in a contested landscape, because both acts claim to take over previously barren natural places, with the goal of civilizing them. But in this case, the landscape really was barren. There's no archaeological evidence here from before this period, and the northernmost boundary stela is thought to have been placed where it is because it came as close as possible to a nearby site of Old Kingdom tombs without intersecting with it. This was indeed Akhenaten's terra nullius. For him, it represented a fresh start, even a new first time, an explicit challenge to Egypt's cultural norms and a dissociation from the traditional Egyptian past. His boundary markers, physically ingrained in a non-traditional cityscape, materially resisted any opposition to his building program. In Egypt, we often see later kings usurping earlier royal works by carving their names in the place of their predecessors. As Jim Allen notes, that's not because they're cheap and want to save on building materials, or because they don't want to celebrate the memory of a past king. It's because these are monuments of kingship. So the reigning king, occupying and embodying the office at that moment, should assign his name to it by right. No one ever usurped any monuments of Akhenaten because no future kings wanted to be like Akhenaten. Egyptian rock reliefs make a connection between permanence and place that seems most obvious in the Amarna stele. The king kept himself to his oath never to move the city by inscribing it in a medium that he considered to be forever fixed, and it seems to have worked. Akhetaten was left exposed and empty thereafter. It was taboo for the Egyptians. Its boundary became an intrinsic part of the landscape, a line that marks a space that no one crosses. Last, a story about meaning. Gebel Sheikh Suleiman is a small sandstone hill at the northern end of the Second Cataract in Nubia. Or it was, before the construction of the Aswan Dam. So I've cheated a bit because this one became mobile in the last century. This hill contained many private inscriptions from various periods, including those of Carian mercenaries and Egyptians who were associated with the nearby fortress of Buhen during the Middle and New Kingdoms. These have been described as the work of men wading in natural rock shelters out of the sun, possibly while monitoring the area from this high point, as the Second Cataract was a key contact and sometimes conflict zone for Egypt and Nubia. The bit of the outcrop I want to tell you about was carted off to the Khartoum Museum in 1963. This block was deemed important enough to save from the rising waters, while most of the other inscribed areas were left in place. It was located at the southern end of the top of the hill. So these are two photographs taken at night by lamplight in 1949. And this is a composite image, so you can perhaps see a little bit better what's going on, but I'll show you an epigraphic drawing in a second. Claire Somaglino and Pierre Tale are the most recent scholars to publish the royal inscription on this block, which I'll get to in a minute. And although they don't discuss the other inscriptions here as responses to it, they do provide this color-coded epigraphic drawing to show that there were, in fact, multiple carving episodes at the same, on the same area. In green, we have probably the latest inscriptions, although they can't be dated. It's not likely that they're all from the same episode. Note that all the way on the left side, the antelope covers right over a part of the royal scene in black. This has caused quite a stir because for the first 50 years after this block was discovered, based on the way it was published, its legs were accidentally included as part of the relief of the main drawing. Right there. This led to the misidentification of the king in the royal inscription because it bears a resemblance to the hieroglyph for that king's name, causing many heated arguments. And this very same image has unfortunately been used very recently in a 2012 book about ancient Nubia. So this is what happens when we try to fully divorce carving episodes from each other but don't quite complete our extraction of one time from another. Back to the drawing. What we have here in red is Egyptian, and it preceded the green drawings. They're the names and low-level titles from the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BC, including the Master of the Hounds, Kheba's son Hetepi, the Master of the Hounds, Kheba, and then it cuts off, but it's the same man as in the first one I just showed you, Mentuwaser's son Mentuhotep, and Amenhotep. On the back of this block are still more names and titles from this period. They all point to an association with the nearby Egyptian fortress of Buhan, and again suggest that these men were present atop this outcrop because they were surveilling the area for the Egyptian establishment as it occupied Lower Nubia. Note how the Middle Kingdom inscriptions avoid intersecting with the original relief. The inscription in the center even changes its orientation so as not to obscure it. And he just makes it. The relief they were responding to has been called one of the most important sources for the history of the relationship between Egypt and Nubia at the dawn of the Pharaonic era. It's the earliest dynastic rock relief, dating to the early First Dynasty, around 3000 BC. It appears to commemorate an Egyptian victory over members of the local Nubian A-group culture, who were once the trade middlemen in this area. Here we see an emblem of the king all the way on the left with a captive, hands bound. In the center, those two wheels with birds on top of them, those are probably represent two towns that were involved in this conflict in some way. And then some unfortunate enemies of Egypt in the aftermath of some riverine conflict. These kinds of domination scenes are known mainly from ritual objects such as mace heads and pallets. It's possible that this scene records a single event, although the king here is anonymous. But in any case, the victory over the Nubians, whose bodies float underneath this boat, was intended to endure and to occur repeatedly once it was carved here in relief. The relief was actually carved using two different techniques, so the main figures are in raised relief and the other elements are just in size, so it's also possible that this itself represents two different carving events. I'm struck by how those Middle Kingdom inscriptions worked around this royal relief. Although in its time it was as formal as royal images could be, with comparable scenes appearing only on ritual objects, it would have looked nothing like the royal iconography of the Middle Kingdom. So despite everyone involved being Egyptian, there's something of a disconnect here. More than 1,000 years after the inscription of the royal relief, did the men of the Middle Kingdom know what it represented? After all, this area in particular was always one of conflict between Egypt and Nubia, and it would have been a familiar theme with the potential to resonate deeply. A millennia-long struggle against one's enemies? Or did they simply understand that it was something vaguely Egyptian, maybe important, maybe part of their cultural past, maybe not? The fact that the same man signed his name twice, once more fully than the other, by the way, where there was more room, suggests that the Middle Kingdom activity on this block was neither the commemoration of a major event nor an attempt to enter into that cosmological time. Instead, it looks like what someone would do if they were waiting in this spot for a long time while they watched the landscape of this frontier zone. These responses demonstrate that something of the Egyptian past at this place was probably acknowledged by ordinary Egyptians during the Middle Kingdom, but whether it was a superficial recognition or a deeper understanding of prior events in this landscape, we cannot say. Make no mistake, the Egyptians did not live in the past. They lived in the now. But part of living in the now for them involved a constant updating of events already solidified in the past, repeating the pattern laid out for them by previous generations in new ways, or avoiding that pattern altogether, and sometimes perhaps not really understanding what that pattern was exactly. In narrating monumentality, Parker used a reverse narrative to ask a series of questions about what makes a monument how it's implicated in time, and how we can access its meaning. So it turns out that with the backwards-oriented Egyptian view of time, this is, I think, a helpful way to reflect on how Egyptian responses to their own material culture were formed. Given the fact that Egypt was by no means monolithic, this strategy allows us to elucidate the impact of monuments that were immobile yet implicated in various social and temporal settings. This is an important lesson for Egyptologists, who are usually specialists of a particular period, and who usually do not consider the afterlives of Egyptian monuments with the same weight as their conception. Although royal works were, in theory, intended to last forever, the era they were made for, those periods we've always been so obsessed with dividing from each other, dynasties and kingdoms, was in reality the shortest act in the whole show. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions.
Hi, Vicky. Yes.
So when we talk about monuments, the same word comes from Latin and means comes from monere in Latin, to remember. So there is also a word in Egyptian, men, which means to be established. So I'm not saying that both words are related, because we don't know, of course. But I know that there is a word, menenu, that means fortress in Egyptian. So I was wondering, what is the word they use to talk about these rock art monuments? Is it the same as they use for stela? Or because I don't know if you have explored this this field, but that could give us information about the meaning of these monuments for Egyptians.
Yes, so that's an excellent question. So when we do have references to this type of monument specifically, the first thing to note is that they call them by the same name as other stelae, which is wedge. But the way they're described is different. So the reference that sticks out for me is a description in the Annals of Thutmose III, where he talks about, so the ones I showed you in Sudan, they have parallels in the Euphrates, or they did. They're missing. They supposedly have them. And he discusses the fact that he creates this, he makes this stela on the Euphrates after he's in Nubia. And he uses a phrase, em shed em ju, which means that he's describing the stela as being dug into the mountain, which has been taken to be an explicit reference to this being different. And the other distinction is in the way they describe erecting a stela versus stamping a stela. So there's the word sa'aha, or aha, to erect, which does not appear to be used to describe any of these monuments. They're all semen instead, which is stamped or something like that. Yeah, I'm looking a lot at the language, actually. The problem is that for early reliefs, for example, like the one I just showed you at the end, there would not be a text that would describe something like that. And so, you know, these terms or descriptions of the activity of carving something like this, they're all quite late, and we don't know how if they were described differently in a different period or not.
Aaron, thank you. They were all very interesting. Are there, I guess not, but I just wanted, are there any cases in which you have later addition that comment on, in any way, that dialogue and comment on the figurative part?
As far as I know. You mean like either editing the figural part in some way, or literally talking about it, or adding a name to it, or something like that?
Yeah, either adding a name or saying, oh, this is a dead body, or adding one body.
No, although what we do have is in the first cataract, there's a high concentration of this type of monument, and later on in the 26th dynasty, there seems to be, there's a habit of cartouche carving again, and they will carve the cartouches as close as possible to an earlier royal stela, but it's not, well, it could actually be read as, I'm the king now, and so I'm replacing your name with mine, but I'm not erasing it. It could be read that way.
Yeah.
but they're next to the monument. They're done in sort of a different style, and they don't usurp it in the same way as, for example, Ramses II putting his name on everything, which he does, and he actually just erases the previous name and puts his in, as I mentioned. Right?
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question about Lorenzo's question or comment, and that relates to the distinction that I was making last night between what counts as legibility and communication, and what is something a little bit fuzzier that maybe is just potential for communication. So when you are asking about whether there is a clear case where somebody is responding specifically or, I don't know, pointedly to the iconography of the previous epigraphic episode, I was again kind of stuck wondering what would actually make for a good definition of response. I mean, aren't all of these episodes responding to one another, in as much as they're, as you showed in some cases, clearly making a point of not overlapping too much, or
my point was more intersecting and enhancing the message. So when you put your name on something, that stays there, and you just try to become part, but not necessarily touching into the message. And I was more interested. So that was.
No, I get it. Yeah, but I guess from a kind of methodological point of view, we are all thinking of the afterlives of monuments. What are we classifying as part of that afterlife legitimately? Are there sort of tiers? Some are more meaningful responses, others are less meaningful, and what are the criteria for deciding? And maybe in the case of Egyptian rock-cut monuments, the criteria are going to be different from, let's say, Assyria or something like that. I don't have an answer, it's just a comment. I'm just struck by how we keep running into this methodological problem.
Well, and also, in this case, most of these places are, well, with the exception of the first cataract area, which is the original boundary of the Egyptian world, and there's a lot of activity there for trade and whatever. Most of these are in very remote places. So it's a very particular type of person with a particular type of job who would be in those areas, usually something related to the military. And this might imply a certain degree of literacy or access to someone who can write for you. And so there could very well be so many different responses that don't leave material remains, not because this, just by nature of where these things are in these remote places, but I think more likely because they're in remote places, because there's a specific group of people who are able to respond to them because they're there. It's different in this case, maybe from others.
A comment on. Oh, sorry.
Okay, it's a quick comment. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just for refining our categorization, I was thinking the usurpation by Ramesses is something different from just putting another cartouche.
Mm-hmm.
So if I put another cartouche, that to me comes close to what is happening in Nahr el-Kalb, with all one stele beside the other. Yeah. But if I really usurp the monument by erasing the former inscription and putting my own name, that to me is a different degree of reuse and afterlife, of whatever you want to call it.
And we have examples of both in Nahr
exactly,
because two of the stele have all of them have
a
Syrian stele next to them, but one of them is then covered by a stele of Napoleon III.
Yeah.
Just as if nothing were there before, and you have to wonder.
That was amazing.
I mean, well, then you don't know what was there before, so. But there's an Assyrian one next to it at that time already, so it could easily be read as still in this place that has some sort of significance to elite culture, military activity. And I just happened to I covered over one, but there are other ones here to signal that.
Final question, Mo?
Thank you. Very interesting. What I find particularly interesting about it is that the presence of Coptic imagery, which is normally ubiquitous because they like to put things on everything. It's interesting that it's almost completely absent from what I've seen in these steel. Like, you know, at Danganronpa, for instance, they have, you know, reused buildings that are completely covered in Coptic things. Okuru, same thing. We have in Egypt, we have several examples of where the Copts like to reuse places that had a special significance. And I was just wondering if in these, if you know of any examples that have Coptic reuse in any sense.
Of royal reliefs?
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Which is very interesting, but Marina is working, so Marina Brown was supposed to join us today, but she couldn't last minute. She was going to talk about the Coptic material. I can't quite remember exactly what her, it was that the Coptic inscriptions were only associated with very specific kinds of private inscriptions in this area. So she's working on that. But as far as formal royal rock reliefs are concerned, there is no Coptic. Which is odd, right? But it also suggests that someone at that time is making a distinction between what they perceive to be royal and non-royal.
Yeah, they do.
So, you know, how long those distinctions hold is interesting.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to finish this. Thank you again.